From the Cray twins to Griselda Blanco, the world has seen its fair share of brutal gangsters. They rise from nothing, kill and maim their way to the top, and usually die in a horrific way that echoes their lives. Let's explore some of the most violent gangsters in history. Imagine being called a monstrous symbol of a disease which was eating into the consciousness of America. Yep, this is Al Capone. Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born on January 17, 1899, in Brooklyn, New York, to a family of Sicilian immigrants. His father, Gabriel, worked as a barber and was part of the massive influx of Italian immigrants who arrived in New York in the late 1890s. Al Capone would be the fourth son of Gabriel and Teresa, and he'd have 5 younger siblings too. From a young age, Al Capone showed violent, impulsive behavior. At age 14, he was kicked out of school for punching a teacher. He never returned to school afterward. He wanted to make quick cash, and he knew he was going to go the illegal way to get it. He hated how Italian immigrants got the lower-class neighborhoods in New York, while the likes of Rockefeller lived in palaces, building skyscrapers and enjoying 10-course meals. When he was 19, Al Capone married a 21-year-old woman named May after she gave birth to their son, Albert. Pressed to make more money and support his family, Al Capone got a job as a bookkeeper in Baltimore. But his ambitions were far larger. He worked as an enforcer for Chicago gangster Johnny Torrio, beating people up for extortion money. And when Johnny's mob boss died, he invited Al Capone to Chicago to become an official part of his gang. This was all happening during Prohibition. Between 1919 and 1933, the US banned the production, importation, transportation, and sale of alcohol. Needless to say, people didn't just stop drinking. In fact, they were more desperate than ever. Prohibition led to 2 things: several deaths due to toxic moonshine and making Al Capone and his fellow gangsters billionaires. Al Capone played a Robin Hood role, saying, "I'm just a businessman giving the people what they want. All I do is satisfy a public demand." But yeah, Al Capone wasn't just a businessman. He was a brutal killer obsessed with removing his enemies and destroying anyone who looked at him the wrong way. One night in a Coney Island bar, Al Capone complimented a woman's butt. The woman's brother was right there, and hearing this, he broke a bottle and slashed Al Capone's face with it. This is how Al Capone got his nickname Scarface, which would inspire the famous movie. His scarred face would match his criminal record. In Baltimore, he killed an illegal street worker for withholding money and a friend who reneged on a gambling debt. In Chicago, he was made head bouncer for the Four Juices building, which had a bar, a brothel, and a few other questionable businesses owned by Johnny Torrio. During Capone's reign, a myriad of unsolved murders took place inside the building. Then there was the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. On February 14, 1929, Frank Gusenberg was rushed to a Chicago hospital with 14 gunshot wounds. But when the police asked him who shot him, he said, "No one." He was afraid to reveal Al Capone's involvement in the shootout. However, 3 hours later, he died anyway. Frank and 6 other members of George "Bugs" Moran's Northside gang had been lined up against a wall and scattered in a rain of gunfire, all arranged by Al Capone. They ended up being greeted there by a bunch of guys in police uniforms. Bugs Moran was arriving. He saw the police car and kept going. The gangsters thought it was just cops coming to harass them and maybe try to get some money. They said, "You guys are going to be transferred for this." A lot of times they did that as show law enforcement, so they had to show that they arrested everybody. But naturally, they got off later on. But they would publicize the arrest. It wasn't cops. This was Al's way of eliminating rival gangs and establishing his monopoly on racketeering, bootlegging, extortion, and prostitution. He was just 30 at the time. A year and a half later, he would be arrested for tax evasion. That's right. You might get away with murder, but don't try to fool the IRS. They couldn't send the FBI in Chicago to get Al Capone because prohibition was the Treasury agent's job. By 1931, Al Capone had amassed a fortune of $100 million, $1.86 billion in today's money, and most of it was due to bootlegging and prostitution. Around the time he ended up behind the Alcatraz bars, Al started showing worrying signs of the disease. Remember how he oversaw a brothel, among other things? Well, he spent a lot of time there outside business hours. He contracted syphilis, but was too ashamed to treat it. He would have risked the information getting out. In 1939, May Capone got her husband out of prison on physical and mental health grounds. But Al Capone wouldn't get to rule an illegal empire for another minute. He lived his last years slowly losing his mind and his organs to the notorious illness. There was an evaluation done that showed that he had the mental capacity of a 12-year-old. Well, 12-year-olds can be bright, but we're talking about quite a come down, quite a decline for a guy who'd essentially run the Chicago mob. So after being released from prison, he was still a prisoner. Then a stroke weakened his immune system even further, and he developed pneumonia. Just after his 48th birthday, he died from cardiac arrest. He was glorified and used as a symbol of Mafia power in so many movies, but he was once the FBI's #1 enemy who took north of 200 lives just to preserve his bootlegging business. How did London's worst criminals come to hang out with Frank Sinatra and Judy Garland? In the 1950s, Ronnie and Reggie Cray were working-class military deserters who dreamed of becoming boxers. By the 1960s, they were West End celebrities. David Bailey wanted to photograph them, and they were invited for TV interviews. Reggie and Ronnie were born on October 24, 1933, 10 minutes apart from each other. They grew up in London's East End. At the time, filth, poverty, and murder dominated the area. The Ratcliffe Highway murders and Jack the Ripper still sent fear through the East Enders' veins, even by the mid-20th century. At age 15, the twins dropped out of school and started working at the local fish market. It was their first and last legitimate job. As teenagers, Reggie became a professional boxer, but Ronnie remained with the dream. Reggie was calculated and rational. Ronnie was like a bull in a china shop. His violent tendencies and his paranoid schizophrenic impulses formed a match made in hell. He was a very, very scary man. Believe me, I've met a lot of scary people. But Ronnie Cray was a very, very sick, psychopathological, schizophrenic, and manic-depressive all rolled into one. In one word of his mouth, he meant everything he said. On the first day of being drafted into the army, Ronnie started a punch-up with their sergeant. They were immediately arrested. In their early 20s, the Crays borrowed money from their older brother Charles and opened a pool hall in Bethnal Green. This was the gathering spot for all the sketchy men the twins had met in prison. Soon, it was a storage for stolen goods. In the mid-1950s, the three dockers invited the Cray twins to their pub for a drink. The twins knew this wasn't a friendly invitation. The dockers were an infamous gang at the time, and they were upset that the Crays were growing their business on their turf. But even though the brothers walked into a trap, they emerged victorious. When the pub's landlord returned, expecting to find the brothers passed out, he found the dockers unconscious on the floor, with Ronnie still beating them senseless. The twins slowly eliminated all gangster competition in East London, and soon enough, they were dominating the whole city. It was a mixture of fear and respect. Respect because women and children were untouchable. Ultimately, guys who went to work, they're untouchable. Any rows we had, it's only amongst ourselves. And if we hurt or killed one another, so what? But that wasn't always true. Ronnie got up and shot a man for a very petty reason. Even Reggie was shocked. Sadly, Ronnie was causing more war between gangs than peace. He was in and out of prisons and mental institutions. In the late 1950s, Reggie bought his first West End bar, Esmeralda's Barn. They took the East End to the West End. You know them ugly-looking bastards with cuts down their faces and all that, and flat noses. And they should have left the club as it was, but of course, they burned the place. Like, they've ruined everything, you know. Anyway, every club they had, the business they had, they've ruined it. After they opened the Double R Club, the craze started mingling with the big stars. By the early 1960s, they were seen as the owners of a lush nightclub on the swinging London scene. Judy Garland, Shirley Bassey, and Frank Sinatra passed through their clubs, sharing drinks and jokes with the gangsters. When this wasn't happening, famed photographer David Bailey was immortalizing the brothers as two interesting characters from the London scene. But there was a problem. Everyone enjoying themselves was half in heart, in fear that Ronnie would go off. I'd see people laughing and having a good time 5 minutes before he walked through the door. The minute he walked through the door, that laughter stopped. The conversation dimmed. People were terrified that he would say, "Are you laughing at me?" And then he had that paranoid feeling that they were laughing at him, and then there'd be a bloodbath. In the mid-1960s, the craze met a swift downfall. They were now at war with the Richardson gang. When one of the crazed men was murdered in 1966, Ronnie retaliated by shooting the killer in broad daylight. Cornell said, "Look who's here," but Ronnie didn't answer. He pulled out a Luger and shot Cornell through the forehead. Cornell slumped forward and eventually fell to the floor, where he died moments later. So far, the twins had bribed the police to stay untouchable. But after this murder, the Met Police built a much stronger case against them. In 1967, Reggie killed his first and last man too, pressed by his mad dog brother. After both brothers were arrested, several of their men testified against them, afraid of what would happen if they were free. They were sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 30 years before parole. This was the longest sentence given for murder in the UK at the time. After serving a few years in the same prison, the craze was separated as Ronnie's schizophrenia was spiraling out of control. He spent 16 years at the Broadmoor Hospital, dying from a heart attack in March 1995. Reggie was released in August 2000 on compassionate grounds. He had terminal cancer and was allowed to live his last 5 weeks in freedom. They remain to this day Britain's most notorious gangsters. Al Capone inspired Scarface, and the Cray twins have their own movie. But James, or Jimmy, Burke is known as the gent behind Goodfellas. Jimmy Burke was born on July 5, 1931 in New York City, but he wasn't Italian or American for that matter. He was Irish, born to a single mother, Jane, who worked as an illegal street worker. When he was only 2, Jane abandoned him at a foster home, and he would spend his childhood in several homes. Perhaps unsurprisingly, he was drawn to a life of crime, and aged 18, he ended up in prison for a few years. That's where he met the Italian Mafia families. Being Irish meant that he couldn't be a made man in the Italian Mafia, but he could be their associate, so he partnered up with the Lucchese family. Somehow, being an outsider worked in his favor. As an outsider, he could float around as a free agent, orchestrating crimes, heists and hits, getting away with almost anything. Jimmy Burke became known as a well-dressed gent with a horrible penchant for violence. Yep, just like Robert De Niro in Goodfellas. Just a few days before his wedding to his lifelong wife, Mickey, Jimmy discovered that Mickey's ex-boyfriend was harassing her, and he had told a few friends about it. On his wedding day, Mickey's poor ex was found scattered about inside his car in a dozen pieces. Yeah, Jimmy wasn't one to just shoot you in the head. And then there was Jimmy's biggest crime, the infamous Lufthansa heist, which at the time, in 1978, was the largest cash robbery in American history. Jimmy Burke first began his plan several months before, over dinner with a bookkeeper. His associate, Henry Hill, learned of a shocking arrangement that was taking place at New York's JFK airport. Once a month, millions of dollars in untraceable American currency would be flown into the airport, the result of monetary exchanges made for servicemen and tourists in West Germany. Once it arrived via Lufthansa airplanes, it would be stored in a vault at JFK. A few years before, several airport employees had stolen $22,000 in foreign currency from Lufthansa. Jimmy learned this and paid them to orchestrate his massive heist. 6 Lucchese family men, Jimmy's own son, and one other member of the Gambino family performed the heist in just over an hour and got away with almost $6 million, just over $22 million by today's standards. Dozens were arrested, and several people went to prison for it, but Jimmy was never caught or charged for the heist. Jimmy specialized in reselling stolen merchandise, untaxed liquor, and cigarettes. He also hijacked delivery trucks that went through Queens, but his greatest pleasure was bribing police officers to learn about informants. He had a thirst for blood, shocking even to the Lucchese family. He even killed his close friend Remo Gaggi after he found out he had a double life as a police informant. Jimmy would dismember his victims, then kidnap their children and lock them inside refrigerators. Their parents would be strangled with piano wire and shot, dismembered, or crushed with car crusher cranes. And he didn't just kill informants. It could even be someone who said something that bothered him. According to Henry Hill, Jimmy Burke was directly responsible for at least 70 murders, though those are the only ones Henry knew about. One might venture to say Jimmy was punishing his childhood abusers whenever he would pour his rage onto the people who looked at him the wrong way or insulted him in a bar. In 1982, Henry Hill became an FBI informant and helped them arrest Jimmy. He was never convicted for the Lufthansa heist though, and was only sentenced to 20 years in prison. In 1998, however, he succumbed to lung cancer in prison. Hey, thanks for watching. What are your thoughts on today's video? What other brutal gangsters do you know? Let me know in the comments section. And before you leave, don't forget to like and subscribe. See you all next time.